Welcome, friends, to At Home with Theosophy. We are exploring the book The Laws of the Higher Life by Annie Besant. Last week we saw another writing that was where Annie Besant explored the attitude of the Theosophical student to revelation, inspiration, and observation. And today we are going to get into the subject per se of the laws of the higher life, where we are going to explore this idea of law from different perspectives, and also the idea of a higher consciousness. So we will proceed as usual to read excerpts from the book and make comments on it. So we will start with what Annie Besant calls the larger consciousness, larger than the waking consciousness of which we are aware normally, as we are going to see. We will start first, before going into the larger consciousness, with the definition of what we mean by laws, and especially by spiritual laws. So she says, many people, in dealing with religion, which has to do with the higher life, seem inclined to remove it from the realm of law and to bring it into some strange region of arbitrary whim, of results without endeavor, of failure without weakness. This idea that spirituality is not subject to law is an idea that is natural at the first sight, for we find the corresponding analogy in the way in which the laws of the physical plane have been overlooked just in proportion as they have been unstudied and unknown. So this is an important point, because even today there is this idea that when we come to the realm of spirituality, there are not necessarily there aren't laws or regularities, or when we look at the physical plane, we know that gravity rules how objects move around, and but we don't know that certain laws rule the development of our inner life. And this is the first point that Annie Besant is going to approach. Here she's going to make an analogy with what happened in the past. In the past, before the development of science, let's say, many of the natural phenomena that we observed, weather or the seasons, etc., they were thought to be the result of the action of the gods, and the action of the gods were not necessarily, they were like whims of the gods. The gods would get angry and do this or that. They would, reward humanity. There was no idea of a regular law behind. And then as science developed, then we come to see that all these activities are ruled by laws. So she says we are right now in humanity in a similar position, but in regards to the spiritual laws. So let's see her argument. She says, we glance for a moment at some sudden eruption of natural forces, some tremendous explosion, but we know that there is nothing disorderly in the outburst of a volcano. All natural processes, sudden or slow, unexpected or predicted, come within the realm of law. It is the same in the spiritual world. We may sometimes see apparently sudden eruptions of the forces of the spiritual realm, a sudden change, for instance, of the whole life of a person, but we have learned to understand that here also law is supreme, that in this also there is nothing disorderly, although much that many do not yet understand. And you see, she brings this idea of a sudden change. This happens in life. Some people have a sudden enlightenment or conversion or experience that seems to come from nowhere, that seems to be spontaneous. What Annie Besant proposes is that all these things have causes and have or follow a certain law, just as the eruption of a volcano is following a certain law, although we may not realize that it is going to happen. And when it happens, it seems sudden, it seems spontaneous, but there are natural forces. Same with spiritual happenings, let's say, or situations. So this is something that the Theosophical teachings were trying to bring into perspective at a time where science was saying that the physical universe is ruled by laws, and that spirituality was really something that was the creation of people's imaginations, because the spirituality was outside the realm of natural law. That's why they would call many of the spiritual phenomena supernatural or a miracle. All of this implies the breaking of the natural laws. So Annie Besant is saying here, these are not breaking natural laws, these are part of the natural laws, but she's extending the realm of nature beyond the physical into the moral and the spiritual spheres. So then, having proposed that the spirituality follows laws, now there is an important distinction to be made, or a certain understanding is necessary to see what we mean by spiritual laws. So first, she examines what we could call the human laws. She says, let us rest for a moment on the idea of law and see what it means. When we speak of the law of the land, you know it is an ever-changing thing, changing with the change of ideas in the authority that makes the law. A law is always a thing which is made, a command issued, and the authority that makes the law can change the law. The authority that creates it can annul it also. So the idea with our human laws, we create the laws, and the laws follow what we think is right or wrong at the moment. And as time passes, we change our laws. And because the laws are created by us, we can change them. We can say, okay, this is the law, but I'm not going to follow it right now. We are going to pardon this action that goes against the law, but there are other considerations, and we decide to pardon it. Or maybe out of corruption, I'm going to apply it here, but not there. This is how human laws work. Then also, she says, the laws are commands. Do this, do not do that. And the commands are enforced by penalty. If you break such and such command, such and such punishment will follow. The punishments are as arbitrary and changing as the laws themselves. They are not the results, in any sense, of the act which has broken the law, but the penalty in every case is artificially attached to the breaking of the law, and it can be changed at any time. So the first point is that the laws are these commands. You have to use your seatbelt when you drive, or you don't have to do this or that. And then to enforce the laws, we create punishments. Now the punishments, as Annie Besant says, they are not directly related to the action itself. I mean, for not using the seatbelt, you pay a fine. Paying a fine has nothing to do, in particular, with the act of using the seatbelt or not. And also, the punishments are arbitrary. In some places, stealing will land you in jail for one period of time or a different period of time. In other places, the punishment may be to, cut your hand off, or whatever kind of punishment the law of the country decides to impose. And today, many countries look at these things in a similar way, but in any case, the idea is that the punishment is arbitrary, as arbitrary as the law is. In some countries, certain things are legal, and in other countries, those same things are illegal. So because this is the quality of human law, many times we tend to think of spiritual laws in a similar way. The laws are imposed by a deity. It is God that says, do this, worship in this way, or work on these days, or, different religious law, let's say. And the punishment for those laws also seem to be arbitrary. If you don't do this, then you go to hell, or you will have a bad, I don't know, effect in some area of your life that is not necessarily the natural result of breaking the law. For example, with a more natural law, and we are going to see that, but we could say that if we overeat, there is a punishment for that. We could say the command is do not overeat. If you overeat, there is a punishment that is a stomachache, or things related to that. So the effect is completely connected to the cause that was this action that broke the law, of a healthy eating. So natural laws have these results that are connected to the original cause, but human laws don't. And when we think of religious laws in the way of, or as a human law, then we tend to think of them with these punishments that many times are disproportionate. And also we think, if this is a law that is imposed by a deity, then that deity can avoid imposing this law on this person in a particular situation. That deity can forgive a person that broke the law, but since this is a law that is artificially imposed, it can also be forgiven. So we have these ideas that the deities can forgive, or that, like in Hinduism, you generate bad karma, but then you do a little ritual, or you bathe in the Ganges, or you do things like this, and then the results of karma are erased. The karmic causes are forgiven. So you see, all of these ideas have to do with the idea that we are dealing with some kind of artificially made law. Now, Annie Besant proposes that we have to think of religious and spiritual laws more in the way that we think of natural laws. So she says, when we speak of the laws of nature, we do not mean any of the things that we have taken as characteristic of the human laws. The law of nature is not a command issued by any authority. Do this, do not do that. It is a statement of the conditions under which a certain thing invariably happens. If such and such conditions are present, such and such results will happen. So as I said, it's not that we are punished with a stomachache because we ate incorrectly. It is just a law. If this happens, then this is the natural result, simply because the stomach cannot deal with what we put there. So she proposes that spiritual laws are the same. It's this idea of karma that we are going to see in future classes in a couple of weeks. Is the same. Many times we think of karma as a deity, like a police deity, seeing what people do and then decreeing some kind of punishment to punish the person that did that action. But the idea is there is no punishment here. It's just a condition, a series of conditions under which certain results are going to come. So she continues saying the laws of nature are unchanging, immutable, unrepealable, because they are expressions of the divine nature in which there is no change. So can we ask for forgiveness? Can we do some trick, give some propitiation or some prayers so that the spiritual laws don't enter into action? Again, from this point of view, it's not possible. As it says, you cannot really break a natural law, and this is exactly what Annie Besant is saying, is applying the same to the religious and spiritual laws. Of course, as she's going to talk about, if you know the laws, you can learn how to work with them, and you can have results that seem to be breaking the law, like, there is the law of gravity, and however we can make an aeroplane that, it has a weight of tons fly. That seems to be against the law of gravity, but that is not so. It's because we understand that law and other laws that we can create results that seem to go against, the law of gravity in this example. So it's not that the laws are or generate a kind of fatalism in which, there is nothing we can do, but what Annie Besant is trying to bring here is this idea that we cannot, that the spiritual and the moral is based on laws, and these are laws that are not human. They are not enforced by an anthropomorphic deity, a human-like deity, and therefore we cannot bargain with the deity so that those laws are not applied to us or are applied in a different way. So then she says, nor is there any arbitrary penalty attached to the laws of nature. Nature does not punish. The result is an inevitable consequence or sequence or succession. It is not an arbitrary infliction or punishment. So this is what I was saying about, natural law. And if you think, this is a very important concept, because the results are always proportionate to the causes produced. So this is something that it's essential. If we think, it all depends on what we think life is about. If we think that life is like a test, a test for humanity to see if they remain, loyal to a particular deity, then you can see things in terms of punishment. And do not do this, because a punishment will come, and that punishment may be overwhelming, an eternity of suffering for an action that was temporal, that was not eternal. And with the idea of a test, that worldview may make some sense. But if we are thinking that the physical plane is more for consciousness to learn, to awake, to develop a certain ability, then it makes more sense that the results can be educational only if they are logical, only if they are proportionate, only if in getting the effect of the action, I can have an insight into the cause of the action. If the result has nothing to do with what I did, there is no learning possible there. There is only to acquiesce to the law out of fear. I will just do this because otherwise I will be punished. But if for example, if we overeat, then I don't know, we lose a finger. There is no correlation there. And you say, okay, I won't do it because this deity doesn't want me to do it, otherwise I lose the finger. But if we overeat and we have a stomachache, then there is something there. There is something there that can teach us why this is not good to do. It's not just, I don't do it because I will be punished. And then Annie Besant goes on and says, and while the human law can be broken, no law of nature can be broken, as we said, the law remains the same, whatever you do. Such is the law of nature, a statement of conditions, of invariable sequences, of inviolable, unbreakable happenings. Thus must you think of it when you come to deal with the higher as with the lower life. So this is her first point, to put things within the realm of law. Now she says that when we start looking at things in that way, there comes to you a sense of perfect security, of infinite power, of unbounded possibilities. You are not in a region of arbitrary whims, where one day this may follow, another day that. You can work with absolute certainty of results. Your own fancies will not change the law. Your ever-changing emotions will not touch the eternal will. You can work with the confidence of result, for you are resting on the one reality which is the one law in the universe. So applied to the practice, this is like, for example, we know on the physical plane that if I make an effort in one direction, sooner or later that effort will yield a result. Now, when we come to the spiritual life, many times we don't have the same sense of confidence. We have this impression that I may try meditating for years and no result will come out of it. Or, there is this uncertainty that by which the different spiritual teachers say, try this, do this and see what happens. If you do this, this will be the results. And then we have this impression that it may work with other people, but perhaps it will not work with us. We have this sense of uncertainty. What Annie Besant is saying here is that if you really get to have a sense of order in the universe and law, then you can be confident that the things that are described sooner or later will happen. Of course, the pace, because there are many conditions, it's not that we start our life right now, we don't have any past, we are isolated from the environment, therefore, the results that we get are only the effects of the causes that we start. The situation is more complex than that. But nevertheless, whatever the situation, we can have the confidence that moving in a certain direction will sooner or later bring the results of that effort, let's say. So this is part of what Annie Besant wants to bring with this idea of laws, so that people feel a certain confidence in life and do what their insight tells them that is the right action, with the confidence that there is a law behind, and that the right action sooner or later will bring the right kind of consequences, let's say. So then she says that for this to work, there is something wanted to work in peace and security in a realm of law. And that thing that is wanted is knowledge. The laws which, so long as we are ignorant of them, may break our plans and frustrate our endeavors, those same laws become our servants, our helpers, when knowledge has replaced ignorance. Let me stop there for a second. So, you see, if there are laws, then the natural next step is that in order to live intelligently, we need to know these laws. If we don't know that, I don't know, when we drop something that is going to fall, then we cannot live effectively on the physical plane. So if we, for example, there are, at least from the theosophical point of view, let's say, There are many things or beliefs that may be wrong and that we are constantly trying to attain a result that cannot be attained in that way. So, for example, we think that happiness can be attained by being selfish, by trying to get everything that I want. And then when we study the laws of the higher life, we may realize that that will never produce the result that we are seeking. So as long as we don't understand our true nature, we don't understand, what the right action is and why one action is right and the other is not, then we may spend all our lives seeking happiness in the wrong way, for example. I don't know, it's the first example that comes to my mind. But the point is that if there are laws, then the natural next step is that we need to know the laws so that we can arrange our life according to those laws. And then she says, how often have I quoted those pregnant and significant words that ought to be engraven in letters of gold? Nature is conquered by obedience. So this is the key point that she's going to make. By obeying nature, we can conquer nature. What does this mean? She says, see how physical nature has taught you more and more this wonderful fact. You see the lightning blaze from the stormy sky, and things are destroyed by the uncurbed flash of fire. How dangerous, how terrific, how mysterious. How shall poor man face the fire of the skies? But man has now learned to harness the same fire to his service, and behold, the same force, electricity or electromagnetism, now carries his messages over seas and lands and joins the Father to the Son, who is thousands of miles away. So with all other forces above and below, so in every field of the universe, visible and invisible. Know the laws of the higher life, and they will carry you onward to your goal. So this is the idea that if we learn the laws, if we begin to understand how life works, and then we adjust our behavior to those laws, then those laws become, as she says, what will bring us to the goal. So, for example, I keep coming to the physical body and health because it's the most obvious aspect that we have. But we know if we want to feel good physically, then we need to lead a healthy life. So if we don't understand that certain things are unhealthy and we keep doing them because we don't know that they are unhealthy, then obviously the result will be that we cannot have a healthy physical body and we will suffer the punishment, for not leading a healthy life. But the moment we start learning about all of this, we can attain our goal, in this case, to have a healthy body, by following the laws. So by being obedient to the laws that rule our health, then we can conquer the problem of health. Now here again, this is a simplification because we have a past. So we may have a perfectly healthy lifestyle, but because there is karma, as we are going to see, some illnesses may be the result of actions that in the past were unhealthy. It's like, we suppose when we are young, we have a very unhealthy life. Then as we grow up, we learn that, we should have a healthier life and we change our lifestyle. But we may still have to reap the results of the first part of our life that was unhealthy. That is only logical. So the same happens, with our lives when they are seen in the context of reincarnation, which we are also going to explore. But basically, the principle is that if we understand the laws and we try to act according to the laws, eventually, sooner or later, that very same law will bring the results that we are seeking. But this is not going to happen if we go against the laws. And if we don't know the laws, it's easy to go against them. So this is the first point that she makes, to bring spirituality within the realm of law, and not of a whimsical law, an imposed artificial law, but within the realm of a natural law. So the next point that we are going to explore is what Annie Besant calls the larger consciousness. And she's going to show that there is that consciousness goes beyond the kind of consciousness that we normally know. And this consciousness that is beyond this larger consciousness is ruled by law also. So there are ways, as we are going to see in the next classes, there are ways to, let's call it for the time being, to develop this larger consciousness, because there are laws and therefore there are methods. But before we go there, let us see the description of the different kinds of consciousness. Annie Besant says, I now pass on to speak of what I have called the larger consciousness. I want to speak of it from two standpoints. From the familiar standpoint of the East, which has learned to study consciousness from within, and which regards the consciousness working in the body, in the physical body, as the lowest manifestation of consciousness, a limited representation of the higher and larger consciousness. And I want to speak from the standpoint of the West as well. So the idea, what she calls the approach of the East, this one that is studying consciousness from within. If we take, of course there are exceptions everywhere. This is just a general statement. But generally speaking, in the East, there was more of an interest of looking at consciousness from the subjective point of view. And in the West, we have the opposite view, and we think that subjective equals non-objective, that is something that is whimsical, something that is not really true, something that is always changing. You see, in the West, we have focused on the so-called objective description of reality. We describe the external world, but then everything that is subjective is more or less outside the realm of science. So it's typical in Eastern philosophy that you will see statements like, when you fall asleep, the world disappears. And for us, Western, people educated in the West, we say that is nonsense. Of course, the world goes on out there. But that is because we have this Western kind of mind in which we are talking about the objective aspect, but for all we know, subjectively, the world disappears. We lose consciousness and there is no more world there. Yes, of course, the external world continues, or at least so we say, of course. But what is the point? When we come to our personal experience, it's important to see how we experience the world, regardless of how it is supposed to be objectively. So we will see a little about this, but basically I think I agree with Besant that generally speaking, when we study consciousness from the point of view of the Eastern traditions, we see a subjective description of the states of consciousness, and then when we study from the Western tradition, we see consciousness more as how it manifests in the external world, on the physical plane, at the level of the brain, for example. So we will see this subject from the two points of view. In this class, she takes on this mainly from the Western point of view, and I think this is interesting because she's trying to show how even in the West there is certain evidence to talk about a larger consciousness. And then we will look at the higher consciousness more from an inner point of view later. So she says, we need not delay on the subject of what is called waking consciousness, the mental faculties, emotions, etc., that you find around you in ordinary daily life. So the waking consciousness is the state of consciousness we are in right now, when we are awake. And when we fall asleep, when we faint, we are not in a state of waking consciousness. We are either asleep or, or we passed out. So what we are going to explore first is this idea of waking consciousness. And Annie Besant says the West began to study these faculties that we have during our waking consciousness through the brain and the nervous system. So you see, when the West tries to look into our mental activity, our emotional activity, where does it look? It looks in the brain, it looks in the neurotransmitters, it looks in the hormones, in the so-called objective side of our being. So she says, gradually, they came to the idea to try to study the workings of consciousness by inducing artificial trance, a trance which would be a dream state under certain definite conditions. On this, we have all the researches of hypnotism, experiments repeated over and over again. At the turn of the 20th century, from the 19th to the 20th, there was a lot of research with hypnotism. They had techniques to make the people fall into deep trances, and then they started discovering that consciousness took on a different appearance or different faculties in many times. People were able to even put their hands on fire without being burned. They were able to see or hear things that were outside the reach of the physical senses, and other things more relevant than this that Annie Besant is going to explore. Now, it is interesting that you see that when trying to look into what consciousness is, again, in the West, we resort to physical means, trying to put the person in a trance by physical means, instead of using meditation, for example. Meditation seems to be too subjective for a Western scientist, although now they are looking more into this. But again, what are they looking into when they study meditation? Brain activity. They don't care much about the subjective experience that the person has in meditation. They are studying the brain and what happens to the brain. So in this case, they were doing some very interesting experiments in hypnotism that I think that is not the case any longer. I don't come across news of experiments that scientists do putting people into a trance by means of hypnotic means. And the hypnotism that I'm talking about is not just like this, like a quieting of the mind and a visualization that you induce the other person to do. That is more like a meditation, a guided meditation. They were able to put people in a trance where people were completely, in a completely different state of consciousness. Theosophy is actually against hypnotism, especially the true hypnotism, the one in which the person loses self-awareness, because the idea is that if somebody can do that and can take control over you, then that is very unhealthy, and eventually people could do that against your will. So Theosophy or the Theosophical teachings are actually against the hypnotism. Again, if we are talking by hypnotism, we talk about like a guided meditation or regression where the person doesn't lose his or her awareness. That is a different situation. But nevertheless, although unhealthy for the people who are hypnotized, there are certain effects that the scientists of the time could see that were very interesting, as we are going to see with Annie Besant here. What was, Annie Besant says, the net result of these widespread, often repeated experiments? This, that under conditions in which normal thinking was impossible, the mental qualities did not lessen in power. On the contrary, the faculties of the mind became sharper, keener, subtler, more powerful in every way when the brain was paralyzed. Because this is the first thing that they discovered. For all intents, this person should be unconscious. However, what they saw is that some deeper faculties, when the brain was in this state of hypnosis or trance, some deeper faculties began to filter through. Now, some people can enter in this trance willingly, like, Edgar Cayce is a famous example of this, or religions have their ways to produce trances, whether by fixing your eyes in a bright spot, or by whirling, or by repeating a mantra constantly. There are ways in which religious people learned to induce these trances, and then something like a higher consciousness would speak through them. As we are going to see from the theosophical point of view, this is not all that useful. It is useful to show that there is something else. It's the same as using drugs. Using drugs, again, puts the brain in a kind of trance, and there is some other kind of consciousness that begins to be experienced. And this may be useful as an indication that there is far more than we know about, like the waking consciousness. But from a spiritual point of view, what we want to do is to be able to access this higher consciousness without having to break the mechanism, or break it for the time being, without having to put the brain into a trance by whatever means, because that is not a healthy. You cannot go through life in a state of trance. So all these higher states of consciousness can be attained without impairing the work of the brain, and that is the purpose of the let's call it the yogic training to raise our consciousness. But for the purposes that Annie Besant wants it here to show that there is something more, these cases were very interesting. She says, to their surprise of the scientists, they found the memory in the trance state reached back over the forgotten years of life and gave up incidents of childhood long forgotten. The powers of reasoning became stronger, more effective in their working under conditions wherein the senses were locked as in sleep. The function of the senses were carried on more effectively through organs other than the ordinary ones. The eye would pierce distances that in the waking state it did not measure, read books that were kept closed, see the interior of the body and describe diseases that were hidden under flesh and skeleton. Similarly with the ear, which could hear a sound taking place far beyond the limit of hearing. So the principle for this, although Annie Besant is not going to go into that, the idea is that the brain enables what we call physical consciousness, but becomes a veil, becomes a hindrance for the non-physical consciousness. So if we can stop the brain in the right way, not stop it completely, because if we stop it completely, then we lose all awareness on the physical plane. But if certain aspects of the brain can be stopped, then the brain can be receptive for non-physical consciousness. So the one that can read a book that was closed is not the visual consciousness. is more of what we call an astral consciousness or a psychic consciousness. For the psychic consciousness, the physical barriers don't exist. So whenever, for example, there is this case with this doctor that had a brain, a problem in her right brain, I think it was, and then all of a sudden she saw unity everywhere. She was unable to see separation, and she had kind of a mystical experience, um, because the functioning of the brain was impaired. And when that aspect of the brain that is constantly setting boundaries stopped its action, then a deeper aspect of reality where the boundaries are not so clear began to be aware, or she began to be aware of that. Now, as soon as the brain healed, then she lost that possibility. So these are examples of how the brain is filtering our experience, is limiting our consciousness, for purposes that are good and natural. To preserve the physical body, we need to see the boundaries between my body and the environment. The problem is that at this point in evolution, that kind of consciousness is silencing higher consciousness that is also part of ourselves. It is through the spiritual life that we can integrate all of this without having, again, as I said, to break the brain or the mechanisms of the brain. We can still access a higher perspective so that all of them are integrated. We can see the separation without losing sight of the unity that is behind. So what they see in this hypnotism is that when the brain is paralyzed, or some mechanisms in the brain, then this higher consciousness begins to filter through. And yes, that's the name of the scientist, Joy Boltle Taylor. So then Annie Besant says, it was also found that the deeper the trance, the loftier the consciousness that manifested. The trance which is not very deep will only show a certain quickening of faculties. Increase the depth of the trance, and the results of consciousness shine out more brilliantly. And this is an experiment that was quite famous at the time. She says they tried experiments with an ignorant peasant woman. They put her into trance, and in trance she became more intelligent. And what was stranger still, she looked down with contempt at her own consciousness in the waking state, criticized its working, spoke disdainfully of its limitations. So in the trance, she started talking as a different person, more intelligent, and talking, as Annie Besant says there, with disdain, about the waking consciousness, or the normal state of consciousness of this woman. And then, still deeper trance, still profounder slumber, and there emerged a loftier consciousness, a consciousness dignified, grave, sober, looking down upon both the other manifestations and criticizing them with sternness and separation and distance, rising above their limitations. Thus, in this peasant woman, 3 stages of consciousness were seen, and the deeper the trance, the higher the manifested consciousness. So in this 3rd level of consciousness, she had a character that was, as she says, as Annie Besant says here, was dignified and firm and calm, but also in this state of consciousness, she regarded the other expressions as being lower expressions. So this was quite striking, because there were 3 personalities which the regular waking state of consciousness could never respond and feel and communicate in the ways that that it did or that the woman did in these other states of consciousness. And then this is interesting what they notice that Annie Besant says here. In her waking state, when out of the trance, the peasant woman knew nothing of the second or the third consciousness. Then the second consciousness, when she was in the first level of trance, let's say, the second consciousness knew about the one below it, but did not know about the one above it. And then the third looked down upon the two, but knew nothing higher than itself. This reminded me in the Gnostic myth of how the universe was created. There is this idea that Sophia, who was an angel representing our soul, Sophia created a god, but this was a lower god, like a physical kind of god, or the god that created the physical universe. And so this god emanates from Sophia, but when the god wakes up, he cannot perceive Sophia. He cannot perceive anything higher than himself. So he wakes up in this empty space and he says, I am the God of the universe. I am the highest. Let me create a universe. And he emanates these, angels that are called archons in Gnosticism. And he is supposed to be the creator of the world, Jehovah, or they call it Yaldabaoth. And the meaningful teaching to me here in this myth is that he was unable to perceive anything higher. And this is what happens with us when we are working through the body. All this question of the higher consciousness seems to be, we may trust spiritual teachers that this is a reality, but it seems to be beyond our experience. We cannot perceive it. And most humanity, because we cannot perceive it, don't really believe that there is a higher consciousness. But when we enter into a higher consciousness, even if it is a little higher, we retain the knowledge of the lower consciousness. We can understand the lower consciousness. So the higher has the ability to integrate the lower, but the lower doesn't have the ability to perceive the higher. So this is what Annie Besant says. Out of this came another idea, that the limited consciousness could not know the larger consciousness, which was beyond its own limitations. The ignorance of the lower was then no proof of the non-existence of the higher, and could not be used as arguments against the higher condition. So just because we in the physical consciousness don't know that there is life after death, that doesn't mean that there is not. Just because we in the physical consciousness don't know about our higher consciousness that may not care about all our fears and desires that we have while in the physical consciousness, just because we don't perceive that consciousness, that doesn't mean that that consciousness doesn't exist. Actually, when we begin to be aware of this higher consciousness, then we realize that this is what we really are. And we may tend to look at the regular life with disdain, as it happened in this trance. And that is what happened with many religious people. Sometimes religious people are criticized because they tend to negate the world, negate the body, negate the lower. And this is because the higher consciousness, when looking at the lower one, has this sense in general of the limitation of the lower. Now, in the Theosophical teachings, there is always this idea that even though the lower is limited, etc., it is necessary part of the experience until it is not any longer. But while it is necessary, there is no gain in just denying it and escaping from it. But there is that natural tendency that the higher regards the lower consciousness with a certain disdain. Then Annie Besant says, now we come to another line of study. People of materialistic thought declared that wherever you find brains in which abnormal happenings are seen, you are there on the lines of disease, and the natural goal of that line is that of insanity. I mean, because what happened is that they see all this higher consciousness when the brain is not working properly. So the typical argument is that this higher consciousness cannot be a good consciousness because it is the effect of the brain not working. So the same with the consciousness that comes when using drugs is just an illusion produced by the brain not working properly, or the near-death experiences of peace and love and all of this is just the result of the brain not having enough oxygen or things like that. There is the idea that because these experiences in most people are experienced when the brain is not working properly, there is the idea that these are just the outcome of a sick brain. So Annie Besant says this idea became a weapon of terrible keenness against all religious experiences. And she quotes what people would say. We have always had visions and mystics and seers. A man who sees visions is a man whose brain is diseased, be he a saint or a sage. All the experiences of the saints and sages, all their testimony to the phenomena of the invisible worlds, all these are dreams of a disordered intellect working in a brain which had become overstrained and diseased. And I think this is the reason why the experiments with hypnotism may have stopped, because they were thinking that, well, these are things that the brain makes up when it is not working properly. So Annie Besant says, I am prepared to admit that this is to some extent right, and it is natural that it should be so. The normal brain, the result of human evolution up to the present stage, is the brain which can deal best with the ordinary matters of the world, with buying and selling, cheating and swindling, getting the better of the weaker, and trampling down the feeble. Why expect from that brain any response to the spiritual impulses of the higher consciousness, or any sensitiveness to the keener vibrations of the higher worlds? This brain is the product of past evolution, and it represents the past. So the normal brain, what we call normal brain, is the brain that is well adapted to the material circumstances. There is a quote from Krishnamurti that he said, to be well adjusted in a sick society implies that we are also sick. And the idea is a little, that the normal brain is the brain that is successful in dealing with the material life. And that brain will not have spiritual experiences because it is a brain that is adapted, that is created to deal with effectively with the material, and therefore it cannot deal so effectively with the spiritual. So she says, but what of the other brain which responds to the subtler vibrations? These are the brains that have the promise of the future. They tell us of the evolution that shall be, not of the evolution that has been. So as she was saying, the normal brain is the result of the past. The other brain is the promise of the future. It's like the beginnings of something that will become the norm in the future. So she says, those who are in the front of evolution are likely, with their subtler, more evolved nature, to be far more easily upset by the coarser vibrations of the lower world than those adapted to it. And the very fact that their brains are responsive to the subtler will render them less fitted to answer to the coarser vibrations of the lower world. So she will go into this a little more, but basically she says those brains that are more sensitive so that they can perceive the higher nature. Not only, I'm not talking about psychic perception, which may be part of this, but simply a person that is more sensitive to human suffering is emotionally far more vulnerable than a person that is completely insensitive to human suffering. The person insensitive to human suffering may become far more successful in the material aims because he or she doesn't care if in gaining their aims, they trample over other people, and a person that is sensitive to that just cannot do it. So there is a natural impairment in the brains that are more sensitive that will make them less effective in the material world. So she says, we have two very different conditions to consider. First, the more highly evolved brain, normally sensitive and ready to respond to subtle vibrations, which is in a state of a very delicate equilibrium, that is the brain of the genius, spiritual, artistic, literary. This will be normally healthy and sane, but not well adapted to meet the demands of the lower life, and careless of ordinary affairs. So we see this that happens a lot with people who have spiritual tendencies. Many times they don't care much about the ordinary affairs of life. That's why it's not very common that you have spiritually inclined people who are at the same time very successful in the world, or you may have spiritually inclined people who are kind of a mess on the physical plane. This is not a general rule. I mean, it's not that everybody is like that, but you can see that tendency that tends to happen. So she says that this kind of brain will be easily jarred by violent vibrations and hence often irritable and impatient, and it will be more or less easily thrown off its balance. And you see that also, the more sensitive the person, the more irritable that person appears. This was the case of Blavatsky, for example, within the Theosophical tradition. To mention somebody closer to us, Dora Kunz, who was a clairvoyant and was a president of the Theosophical Society here in America. She always had that kind of irritability. And it's not that this is a flaw of character, that the person is irritable because that person is intolerant or something. It's just that there is more sensitivity and the nerves respond, more keenly to the external situations. So for this reason, in the Theosophical view, there is always, if we judge the spiritual maturity of a person by how the physical body responds to life, we are losing sight of another aspect, that is, the physical body is just an external instrument. It's not what the person is. And if the body is too sensitive for the environment that that body is in, that body may be irritable. And you could say, well, how this person would be, why do you say this person is spiritual if the person is irritable? And then you see this very materialistic person that is so nice and polite. So you see, things are far more complex than that. Of course, part of the training in the Theosophical tradition is there is a whole thing about what kind of diet is recommended, what kind of exercises, etc., to try to minimize the impact of the higher consciousness on the body. But there are some cases in which the body is just too sensitive, and that cannot be prevented. So Annie Besant says, later in evolution, these kind of brains will have gained stability and elasticity, but at present, they easily lose equilibrium. So this is a case of many people. And then she says, the second is the normal brain, generally unfit to respond to subtle vibrations. But then under the stress of keen emotion, it is rendered abnormally sensitive and tense, and this is the brain of ordinary religious, mystic, and seer. Strong emotion, intense desire to reach the higher life, prolonged fasting and prayer, anything in fact that overstrains the nerves, will for the time render the brain sufficiently sensitive to answer vibrations from the subtler planes of being. The superphysical consciousness finds for a brief time a vehicle sufficiently sensitive to receive and answer to its impulses. Then visions and other abnormal happenings will occur. So this is something that is observed, that religious people have seen, that when they put the body to a stressful situation, either by fasting, by certain intense physical activity, etc., the people become more sensitive to non-physical consciousness. As Annie Besant says here, and she's going to talk a little more about this, the state of strain, physical, emotional, mental, makes the personality be more receptive to this kind of higher consciousness. But of course, this is not a healthy way of going about it. This is why some people in a state, when they go through a deep crisis, an intense suffering, some people have some kind of religious experience, and they say, God talked to me, at the depth of my suffering. Because if the brain is at that point, which is very close to the breaking point, then the person may become momentarily sensitive to the higher consciousness. And then that is interpreted with whatever, religious elements that the mind of the person has. It is God or an angel or whatever it is. So many of the mystics, because there is this idea in the history of mysticism that many mystics were also hysterical people or crazy people, the crazy wisdom of some of the mystics. And that is the case because of this particular situation, that they had a brain that was not necessarily naturally sensitive, but that in extreme conditions they would become sensitive to that. And so they would go through, austerities to induce that. So Annie Besant explains the tension throws the brain more or less out of gear, which shows itself as nervous disorder. Hysteria and other nervous diseases will, in these cases, frequently accompany such phenomena. But the vision itself belongs to the superphysical world. So some mystics, may have a vision. That vision was real, but then there are the other effects, the hysterical effects, or that those belong to the brain. Now, the fact that the brain is not healthy doesn't mean that the vision was not real, although it may be later on interpreted in a more or less correct way. And then she says the reason why there should be this danger is simple. Take a string, which when loose will not give out any musical note. Make it tense, and the note will sound out from the tightened string. But also it is then that it is exposed to the danger of snapping. And so with the brain. So we are coming to the end. She says, however, when evolution is understood and wisely guided, it is not necessary that disease should be the condition of these higher experiences. And this is what I was talking about in the Theosophical discipline, tries to minimize all those side effects as much as possible. And then she says, look to the East and see how this danger has been understood and guarded against and avoided. Eastern psychology postulates a self that gathers around him vehicle after vehicle, gradually shaping his own instruments, a mental body, an astral body, and a physical body, gradually shaping these things, in order that by that his powers of thinking or emotion and activity may work in the outer world. In Eastern psychology, we are dealing with a consciousness which shapes the bodies. So instead of trying to generate external conditions uh, to affect the body, the idea is that consciousness from within begins to affect the bodies. Now, how shall the bodies be shaped to the needs of the higher consciousness? By gradually refining them and bringing them under the control of the higher. And hence, meditation is ordained as a means. But where a person wished to make very rapid progress, it was found easier to go to the jungle and temporarily isolate himself from the lower world. Thus he escaped the coarser magnetisms of the outer world and put himself in a place in which the rougher vibrations did not reach him. Hence he was less likely to be upset by these harsher and rougher vibrations. This is very important to understand because today many of very intensive and even aggressive techniques from the East are brought into the West. All this work on Kundalini, the chakras, prana, holding the breath and manipulating the breath. But we lose sight of the fact that all this was done when the person was in isolation. That person didn't have to deal with any external problem, with any noise, with any disturbance. And then their bodies could deal with this intense and, as I said many times, aggressive kind of discipline. Now, when we bring all of that to the West, that is so stressful, many times this results in psychological problems and breakdowns because we are pushing the body too much and the body cannot bring the two things together. So the Theosophical approach is leave that for the future. That is fairly easy to do. What is the most difficult aspect of the spiritual work is to transcend your identification with your ego, to discover, your true nature. This takes lifetimes and lifetimes of work. Developing certain powers, working with the chakras, with Kundalini, that can be done even in a few years. It's a very easy and superficial aspect of the spiritual work. So leave that for the future. When you have an incarnation in which you can retire from the world, work on the other more important part, that is this inner transformation. And that is normally the policy in the TS, and is quite healthy. You very rarely see people in the Theosophical tradition that they have all these problems that people in other traditions have when they try to mess up with all these other aspects. Living here in the West without having a clairvoyant guru that can guide them, etc. And so then in the jungles and forests, such men began to meditate. They made the brain tense and refined by the concentration of the mind, fixed in rapt attention on the higher. The consciousness working from above played on the physical brain and gradually made it more tense and tuned it to respond safely to the higher vibrations. Then it strove to draw the lower upwards until it answered no longer to the stimuli of the outer world. The same insensitiveness to the outer vibrations that hypnotism gains by artificial means is gained in yoga by complete withdrawal of the consciousness from the senses, the indriyas. So you see, this is what I was mentioning, that this is the way of the spiritual way of generating what hypnotism can generate. And we can meditate, every day during our daily life. There are meditations that don't mess with the energies, and we can learn to do all this while we work in the world. But for example, Annie Besant had to let go of her clairvoyance when she started working for the freedom of India, because the two things were not compatible. When she started getting, involved in all this discord of the political struggle, all that was too much for the body to face, while keeping so open to all these other vibrations. So she had to give it up, and in order to do this other job. All right. So the idea here is that there is a higher consciousness, and there is a way to bring that higher consciousness into the waking consciousness by means of the spiritual practice, and we will see some of this in the next classes. But at the same time, we have to realize that the more we develop spiritually, the less we will engage with the outer world. And by that, I don't mean that we will abandon our family, but naturally we start letting go of materialist goals or materialist enjoyments or things like that. There is a shift in consciousness. So the two things in general cannot be there together. And sometimes modern spirituality is trying to retain the two things, and that's why it doesn't work either, in one direction or the other. So anyway, we will look at all this in more detail in the future.